All right, high rollers, it's been a while since we've had this guy on. One of the greatest Twitter feeds in darts. Dare I say one of the greatest minds as well. A statistical analyst for the Professional Darts Corporation. You've probably seen his articles on PDC.tv. He's appeared on Darts Planet. And if you haven't followed him yet on Twitter, be sure you do. At Wikipedia. Chris Kempf, our guest today. Chris, welcome back to the show, man. Thanks for being our high roller today.
Always a pleasure, Derek. Thanks a lot.
I mean, where do we start? So much has happened since we've last spoke. Let's start with the BDO news today. They've signed a 3-year deal with Eurosport. Big news, all 3 majors, 9 events in all. Quest is involved across Britain as well. Eurosport will carry the events across the UK, across the Netherlands, and across Australia. So this is great news for darts fans and the BDO, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even though I work for the PDC and I mostly follow the PDC's events, I think it would be sort of foolish to not recognize that there are a lot of serious and very competitive darts players over in the BDO. And I don't think they've been very well served in the past couple of years by the tournament structure, the prize funds, and the lack of TV coverage that they've had. Now, obviously, the BDO would much prefer to have the BBC broadcasting from Lakeside come January. But if this is their plan for the future to have full TV coverage of all 3 tournaments, I mean, that's fantastic for them, and especially for the women, because there's some excellent players in the women's game, and they deserve to have a lot more exposure.
Yeah, and they passed over on Lisa Ashton for the Grand Slam. We're going to talk about the Grand Slam later, and of course the BDO comes over and plays against the big boys from the PDC, so lots to talk about. And I said, where do we start? I guess we have to with James Wade, right? I mean, you call him the MacGyver of darts.
Well, he always seems to find a way to win when you don't expect it. And obviously it's become a bit harder for him in 2018 than it was in, say, 2008, just because the overall standard of play has risen. And obviously things are a lot easier when you don't have to play MVG, which was the case in Wade's last run to a big TV final. But Wade deserves a lot of credit because he was absolutely no one's pick to win this tournament, and he endured a lot of match darts and still came through in the end. I mean, this is a guy who doesn't beat you by putting in all the 180s and enormous checkouts that a Peter Wright or Rob Cross or Michael Verheeren can do, but he's just going to do enough 140s, enough sort of small combination checkouts like 65 and 81, and he's going to win more last leg deciders than you. So he is a very resilient player considering how far advanced the standard of darts has gone in the past decade.
Yeah, they call him the machine, and he keeps chugging along. You know, his sort of style over the years, and all the commentators make mention of it, is that he'll just beat you. If it's a close match, he finds a way to win. That's the thing about Wade. And this past weekend, he definitely found a way to win. I mean, a lot of the top guns went out early. I had mentioned that the final between him and Simon Whitlock was a tired final. I mean, it was a long day. They played 3 long matches. And he found the way to win. I mean, he was there at the end of it. He won it.
He has more experience in longer matches than most players do. I mean, you look back at all the World Championship quarterfinals and semifinals he's played, all the matches in the Grand Slam that he's played. He just has a lot of experience of keeping his play at a very serviceable level between, say, 90 and 95 average. Whereas if you look at an MVG, he may do, 59, 60, 45 and lose a leg by an enormous margin, and then come back in the next leg and do an 11 darter. So it's a very different style of play, and it's one you don't see very much from especially the younger players of today. Wade is sort of a rare breed.
I mean, you delve into the numbers. How do you keep a statistical analysis of players having babies and then winning? I mean, he dedicated the title to Arthur, his new baby boy, and man, they seem to have some extra motivation.
Well, you can never really say how it's going to affect a player. I mean, there was a lot of speculation about MVG around the time that his daughter Zoe was born. The stress of his wife giving birth was having an effect on his game. But for some players, it's an encouragement. For some players, the stress of having to worry about what's going on with the birth can be very cumbersome for a player's game. Obviously, there aren't enough players in the PDC whose wives are giving birth often enough to have give a detailed statistical analysis, right. this sort of thing. But maybe we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, maybe, right? Okay, you tweeted this. Days elapsed since last singles title, and this was the day after James Wade won. Of course, James Wade one day. Michael Van Gerwen, we've talked before how if you had $20 for every title he won, you'd be a rich man. 15 days since his last title, and then the list carries on. And some of the players near the bottom here, Robert Thornton, more than 1,000 days. Jelle Klaassen, more than 1,100 days. Raymond Van Barneveld, 1,621 days since their last victory. It was a few years for Wade, but nowadays on the PDC, anything can happen on any given weekend.
Yeah, I mean, Raymond Van Barneveld is in a good position just by virtue of having played the World Series Tour. So that will give him one of his better chances to win a title in the World Series Finals coming up. To be fair to Barney, he just hasn't played very many Players' Championship Euro Tour events. It's difficult for him because he has a family to think about too. He's got grandkids. He wants to spend time with them. But at the end of the day, the Order of Merit does not care. And 2 years after you've won a title, it's gone, and it doesn't come back. So a lot of fans are looking at that 4.5 years since Barney's last title, which was the 2014 Premier League, and they're saying, I wonder how much longer Barney has. If he takes a dive in the rankings after the next World Championship, he may be thinking about what might happen with his career. I hope he stays in as long as he can because I really enjoy watching him. But there's only so long you can go without a consistent flow of income from those Players' Championship events. £2,000 one weekend, £1,500 the next, and that keeps your ranking up. And that's something that Raymond Van Barneveld just hasn't had the benefit of having.
Yeah, especially nowadays with the roster top to bottom just full of elite players. I mean, anybody can win on any given weekend. We're going to talk more about the qualification scenarios in a bit, but I got some more questions about this European Darts Championship. As a darts fan and as a guy who breaks down the numbers, it was a double whammy for you. I mean, talk about pure drama. You talk about monster checkouts and big moments. That was the tournament, right?
Yes, and I had a bit of a chat with the PDPA's Andy Scott a while back, and he had mentioned that in the two semifinals, it may be the first one in PDC history where all four players in those semifinals had darts to win. Honestly, as much of an MVG fan as I am, having MVG out of the tournament does sort of increase the drama and increase the tension a little bit, because you take a look at those matches where you have players who aren't used to facing each other in that long format in front of that kind of crowd, and you have some unusual things happening. Obviously, the averages aren't quite, what we would expect for, say, a European Championship semifinal or final. But that doesn't make the darts any less exciting to watch. The average is just a number, and it's just something for a statistician like me to obsess over in my spare hours. But it's watching a tournament like that is really just the sort of thing where you minimize the Excel spreadsheet on your laptop window and you just watch and enjoy.
Well, I was enthralled, and I expected everybody to hit the double on a big checkout. You tweeted this. Of the 7 last leg deciders in the Euro Championship, 5 were won with a 101-plus checkout. All 5 losing players were on a finish. I mean, it was touch and go. Chizzy, of course, the 157, Webster's 156, Whitlock had a 110, West 106, Wade 102. Hopp had that big 156 finish, had a 164 in the quarterfinals as well. Was there any one that stood out for you, or were they just all marvelous?
Well, they were all marvelous, but I do give a lot of credit to Dave Chisnell on that 157 checkout, because that was generally tipped as sort of the most competitive, most difficult match for either player facing each other in that contest. And Chizzy is not necessarily known for someone who has had a lot of exciting, memorable moments in last leg deciders. He's come up short in a lot of tournaments, and in this one, obviously the next match wasn't so kind to him, but in that 157 checkout scenario, I was thinking Adrian Lewis has got this. 3 darts from 36, and no chance Chisholm comes back. With a 157. I mean, the chances of hitting a 157 in that kind of scenario, maybe 3-4% at best. So if Adrian Lewis comes back to take out 36 and 3 darts, we would expect from average percentages across the PDC on a checkout like that he would have a 70-75% chance of taking it out. So for Chisnell to defy the odds in that way and put forth a fabulous effort in a deciding leg was really gratifying to see from Chizzy, and I hope we get to see a lot more of that.
Well, it really was magnificent finishing, and it was fun to watch. I just loved the tournament. Got to talk about Max Hopp. Before we talk about the Maximizer, though, what about the German crowd? Any way to analyze the fourth dart? I mean, it's tough to play against them when they're whistling and jeering like that, isn't it?
Honestly, as any player on the PDC has figured out, who's played the European Tour and has had to play Max Hopp or Martin Schindler or Dragutin Horvat, it certainly appears to make a difference. But in some cases, there are a lot of tournaments now where there's quite a bit of crowd noise and quite a bit of partisan crowd noise. So when Michael Verheeren lost the World Championship semifinal, there was a lot of attribution to crowd noise there too. But I think MVG in particular should be so accustomed to that sort of influence on a match by this point that doesn't really excuse his missing all those match darts against Rob Cross. I just feel bad about the players who have to play Max Hopp or Martin Schindler, and it's not Max Hopp or Martin Schindler's fault. It's just that the crowd is very partisan in support of their countrymen. I just feel bad for the players who may not have had as much TV experience in an event like that, who have to play Max Hopp or Martin Schindler, and it is very different from any time they've faced those guys before on the Players Championship Tour. It does have an effect, and I wish there was a way we could measure the decibel level of when their opponents are throwing to see, does it really have an effect, say, on the doubles percentage? It would be interesting to look at, but we'd need a lot more data to analyze it effectively.
Well, I gotta feel it does. I mean, it creates great atmosphere for the viewer, but for the opponent, it's really tough. I know James Wilson had a real tough time of a 10-7 he lost, and he made a joke on Twitter the next day that he went into a quaint coffee shop and asked for a tuna melt, and the lady behind the counter whistled and booed him for 30 seconds. I thought that was quite funny. Okay, big weekend, though, for the Maximizer, right? I mean, it's a big stage. He's right there at the end. You tweeted about his ranking income in 2017, 14,000 pounds. On that weekend alone, he picked up 20. I mean, it's amazing how anything can happen.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine how little you were thinking about Max Hopp last year. Because I think he had maybe one win in that entire year against a top 16 player.
He was a non-factor.
Yeah, he was, 14,000 pounds in a year in ranking money. That's putting you outside the top 64. I mean, that's if Max Hopp had continued at that level, he'd have to go back to Q school and play for his tour card all over again. So, for Max to have turned his game around, it's really impressive. And I think Max is just such a classy player. And, I think he even felt a little bit embarrassed about the crowds that were so vocal in supporting him. But, a ranking semifinal like that is something that very few people in the PDC achieve, especially a ranking semifinal on TV. So, full credit to Max Hopp. He had a fantastic weekend, just a sliver outside the top 32. But once he gets in there, we're going to be seeing a lot more of him on TV.
And let's not forget, he's only 22. And you mentioned it. It's not his fault. I mean, if he doesn't make those shots, he doesn't win regardless of the crowd. But this kid is young and so composed.
Yeah, he can't control what the crowd are going to do. I mean, the only thing he can control is his own behavior on stage. And from what I've seen so far, nothing to criticize him for. For a player to compose himself that well, comport himself that well at such a young age, it makes me wonder what kind of player he's going to be 10, 15 years from now. And I just have a feeling it's going to be quite impressive.
Well, he seems to have no problem with the big moments starting at the age of 17. You tweeted out, and by the way, if you don't follow at Wikipedia, you should. It's great content. You tweeted out, Hopp has hit 3 for 3 on the bullseyes this weekend, bringing him up to 41% of the year. Remarkable considering the PDC average is 23%. And then you mentioned the PDC's top 3 bullseye hitters, 45% for Cullen, Wade at 43%, and there's Hopp at 41%. The bullseye's a big factor in some of these close contests.
Well, it's just sort of, it's like having a magic wand in your back pocket if you can hit a 164 checkout or a 161 checkout, because on average, players only hit those maybe 2 or 3% of the time. If you can do that, if you can hit a 161, say, maybe 10% of the time, suddenly players are going to have to be concerned about any finish that you're leaving. And I would just challenge any person out there who still doesn't believe that Hopp is the real thing to try hitting 41% of their checkout bullseyes themselves, because that's something that not even Michael Verhoeven does 41% of his checkout bullseyes this year. I mean, that's astonishing. For all those top bullseye hitters to be in the semifinals of the European Championship, it's just, you're going to have some good checkouts coming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing stat, isn't it? 41%. I love the tweet. Is the guy's name Elben Berg that you referenced?
Yeah, he's a German composer. It just happens to be from his opera Wozzeck. And there's a little kid singing "Hop, hop, hop, hop," and I don't know why I thought of that, but I happen to have the score nearby, and it's like, yeah, there it is. I guess we know who Alban Berg is supporting.
I love that tweet. That was absolutely classic. Okay, a couple of guys that I want to talk about real quick here. Boris Koltsov, I know he made a lot of press this week qualifying for the Worlds, and the Polish Eagle, Krzysztof Ratajski. And I love stories like his. I mean, this guy just plugs along, and there on one weekend just dominates. I mean, back-to-back Players' Championship titles. I mean, if you put the work in, you can win the money.
And let's recall for a second that Krzysztof Ratajski doesn't have a tour card.
Amazing.
Incredible to think that, if you think back to Q School and all these players who missed out on qualifying, how many more Krzysztof Ratajskis are out there who are just waiting for the chance to show you what they've got in a ranking event like that? And as for Boris, I mean, he absolutely dominated the EADC, which is the Russian qualifier. For whatever reason, Alexander Oreshkin, his doubles partner at the World Cup, wasn't there. But Koltsov is another young player. He's in his 20s. He's another young player who really has the potential to make a big mark on the World Championships. I mean, this is a guy who basically every match he was playing in that EADC qualifier was 90-plus average, lots of 180s. Obviously, we're not talking about the same venue as the Ali Pali, but for Boris Koltsov to have such a strong showing in his qualifier, it's very impressive, and I hope we get to see a lot more of him in December.
Do you ever give any thought to pain and darts? I mean, you mentioned earlier the Chizzy finish on Adrian Lewis, and you saw Jackpot just sort of look to the heavens as if he couldn't believe it. I mean, he was coming back to win the match. And then Joe Cullen, I mean, the look on his face as he was being hugged, he was one leg away. Was that a collapse? I mean, there is pain in darts.
Well, I think it must have been especially painful for Joe Cullen, especially after he had missed those match darts against Gary Anderson in the World Match Play. He's come very, very close to a career-making moment. Obviously, he's in the top 16 now, so he's in great shape. But when you come that close, when you get to a last leg decider and your opponent takes out a big old finish to end, you're done in the tournament. You can go home now. That's just a crushing feeling, and for some players it just happens to them more than others, whether it's due to stage experience, last leg decider experience, maybe it's a certain amount of intrinsic psychological quality that makes people more resilient in some situations than others. It's absolutely fantastic to see for just for a spectator's point of view that such a dramatic thing can happen in a darts match like that. But yes, I'm glad I wasn't in Adrian Lewis's shoes or Joe Cullen's shoes at those moments.
I gotta feel it's hard to measure experience, and I believe it was Simon Whitlock who nailed that 110 on Joe Cullen, and I mean, Cullen was just devastated. He was in disbelief and shocked. I mean, it was just crazy to watch. He just couldn't believe it. And there's Simon Whitlock, one guy we haven't talked about. He like James Wade, kind of plugs along, and his experience shines through on the day sometimes, and there he was.
It does. I mean, unfortunately for Whitlock, he's still in my list of players who has, I think it's a good 800 days since his last PDC title. I think it was a Players' Championship event early last year. But he's made 4 ranking finals this year. 4 ranking finals? Let's see. The 2 Euro Tour events, the European Championship, and maybe it's 3. So he's made 3 ranking finals this year, and he hasn't really shown us, the sort of top-level Simon Whitlock that we were seeing at sort of the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017, and that we saw with a lot more regularity, say, 8-10 years ago. But you can make quite a bit of money just cleaning up from other people's mistakes and reaching a bunch of finals and reaching a bunch of semifinals, because in a lot of ways, winning titles is nice, but if you are knocked out in the first round of your next couple of events, it's better just to reach the final every time.
Yeah, consistency really pays off. Now, everything we've talked about kind of centers on what you really wanted to talk about today, which is the qualification scenarios and how the World Series of Darts is like a backdoor route for the Grand Slam. And lately in the PDC, we talk about everything on the line, all these ranking points. You recently wrote an article on PDC.TV, and you write, 2 years is a long time in darts. At this time in 2016, Phil Taylor had just won the inaugural Champions League. MVG was about to complete a romp through the year of TV events, and Rob Cross was still an unknown. For some, all that ranking money they earned is just falling off right now. So every match seems to matter at this point.
Well, if you think about, say, the World Series Finals, it's not a ranking event, but in some ways it is, because if you are not currently qualified for the Grand Slam, you need to reach the final to qualify for the Grand Slam, and then you get a minimum amount of ranking money. So in a way, it is a little bit like a ranking event. Obviously, for the players who are accustomed to the bigger TV events, the European Championship, the Grand Prix, the Players' Championship Finals, the prize money on offer in the World Series Finals is not at the same level. But if you can reach the final of the World Series Finals, it has the sort of unusual effect of, if you are selected as a wild card for the World Series Finals, you can actually qualify for a ranking event by having been chosen as a wild card in an unranked event. So it's an unlikely possibility, but it is possible to see something like Dave Chisnell go from the first round, reach the final, qualify for the Grand Slam, and then knock out Krzysztof Ratajski, who is 16th on the list of 16 players who could qualify for the Grand Slam. So that would have the unusual effect of a player who hasn't won a title this year reaching the final and getting into the Grand Slam ahead of someone who's won 2 ranking titles. So in a way, the World Series Finals is really more interesting just to see, who can make the final push to the Grand Slam, because we still have Daryl Gurney, who's not qualified for the Grand Slam yet. Darren Webster, I don't think, is qualified. If Daryl Gurney can't make the final, he's going to have to go through the special qualifying event a couple days before the Grand Slam to see if he can just get in. Even if he does, he might be stuck in a group with Michael Verhoeven, or he might get stuck in a group with Peter Wright. The qualifying scenarios for Gurney get worse and worse the later he puts off his, when he qualifies for the Grand Slam. But it's an interesting time, because there's a lot of possibilities of ways you can get yourself into events. There's ways you can fall out of contention for certain events. It's the sort of thing that a statistician like me is always very interested in.
Well, I know in that article you mentioned Brendan Dolan. I mean, this is a tough time for him because a lot of his ranking money is going to fall off. Other players have had a bad year. I know Chris Quantock was in trouble. Benito Vandepass hasn't really played his usual self. I mean, a lot of things happen, and it really is about consistency and maintaining your level throughout.
Yeah, and one of the players who's done a good job of that this year has been Dave Chisnell, because Dave Chisnell was defending an enormous amount of ranking money that he earned in 2016. So 2 years later, he has to find a way to replenish all that money that he had lost. Honestly, I didn't think he'd be able to do it, but he's made enough quarterfinals in the TV events. He's had a very good showing on the Players' Championship Tour without actually winning a title. But it's all about just accumulating enough money to keep yourself qualified, keep yourself in the top 16, top 32 if need be, just so that you can be in position to qualify and have a favorable seeding when you do qualify. And you can also take a look at James Wade. I mean, he's just collected £100,000 from the European Championship, which is obviously fantastic for his ranking. But now he has to defend the money he made as the runner-up in the Grand Slam in 2016. So he's in a position where, after the European Championship, he's gone from 9th to 6th in the world rankings. But if he can't defend the £40,000 he earned 2 years ago in Wolverhampton, he's going to fall right back down to 9th again. So it's just a constant struggle to match the earnings that you made 2 years ago, which is obviously very difficult for MVG because he won everything, and to try to improve on the showings that you had 2 years ago so that you can move forward a little bit in the rankings.
Well, I don't know how guys like you and Burton DeWitt figure all this stuff out because it's constantly changing. I know you like to make maps. I mean, I don't know how you map all this stuff out, my man.
Well, honestly, I think Burton deserves a lot more credit than I do because he's been doing this for far longer than I have. And, every tournament that happens, he's out with qualification scenarios for the next 2 years' worth of tournaments coming up. So I've always focused more sort of on the sort of question of if you increase a player's treble percentage by this much, how much of an advantage does it give them? But I've been moving a little bit more into the rankings too, and it's just the more I do, the more I appreciate what Burton's been doing because it's just indispensable.
Well, we're running short on time, but I got to ask you about, there's going to be no women at the Grand Slam, but there are 2 spots up for grabs coming up shortly for the World Championships. That's going to be very interesting. I'll be keeping my eye on that. And then I just got to ask you, as we, count down towards the World Championship, you're going to scoff at this. Many people call MVG's 2018 an off year. Now, before you list all the titles, he certainly hasn't won some of the majors. There's a lot more talent. It really is cutthroat. What do you think's going to happen at the World Championships this year? You got any prognostications for us?
Well, the field and the prize money is so huge now that I think if MVG, I think for MVG now, that's the only major because he's won so many things 3 times, 4 times. I think, he's not going to want to have to look back on his career and think I only won 2 world titles. So I think it's hard to imagine Rob Cross defending his title this year. I could be wrong. I mean, he's obviously proven that he can show up at the right time and get the job done, but he's just not as impressive as he was last year. I think you have to regard MVG as the favorite in the World Championship until proven otherwise. The odd, poor match like the one against Steve West aside, there's a good chance he could just come back in the next game and do 110 like he did on Paul Nicholson. I wouldn't be surprised if James Wade comes back and makes another deep run. If Mensah is finally able to break through to, say, quarterfinals, semifinals. But a lot of it will depend on where these players end up as far as seeding goes once we get done with the Grand Slam and once we get done with the Players' Championship finals. Because the difference of being seeded 8th and having to play Michael Verhoeven earlier versus 7th and having to play potentially Peter Wright is the sort of thing that could make an enormous difference in a Players' World Championship campaign.
Absolutely. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Paul Lim. I mean, amazing.
I just hope we get someone to follow Paul Lim around with a camera so that we can see as much of him as we can. Just a legendary player, coming from the U.S., him having played for the U.S. in the past. I think he's just probably the world's best ambassador for darts. Great competitor, a historical personage in his own right. I've got nothing bad to say about Paul Lim, and for someone of his age to be doing all the stuff he's doing, long live Paul Lim, and I hope I'm doing that sort of thing when I'm in my 60s.
Oh my God, can you imagine? I mean, the guy is unbelievable. What a pleasure this has been. One of the great minds in darts, one of the great Twitter handles too, at Wikipedia. If you don't follow him, please do. Real treat today, man. Thank you so much. Chris Kempf, thank you, man.
You're too kind, Derek. Thanks a lot.